So our first speaker is going to be Merlyn Mowrey. Dr. Mowrey will be talking about an old view of nature, a new view of heroism. Dr. Mowrey has been sort of a usual suspect at Becker events, and many of you probably saw her in the film today. Dr. Mowrey is Associate Professor of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Central Michigan University and holds a PhD from Temple University. She has been at Central Michigan since 1988, teaching courses in social ethics and religion, dealing with topics such as death and dying, religious violence, race and discrimination, and gender and patriarchy. Her essay, Death, Anxiety, and Religious Mystification in the Thought of Ernest Becker, A Feminist Reconsideration, appears in Death and Denial, a book edited by Dr. Leckie, who is here as well. So she'll be presenting her paper, and that will be followed by Dr. Sally Cannell, who will be presenting The Limits of Loneliness. Dr. Cannell is Associate Professor and Assistant Chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at St. John's University in New York. She received her PhD in theology in 1984 at Fordham University, where her dissertation was The Concept of Mortality in Ernest Becker, a foundation for contemporary theology. And she's written 2 spin-off articles from that dissertation topic. She's also substantially revised that into a book, Mortal Gods, Ernest Becker and Fundamental Theology. She centered most of her research on conversion and grace, and in 1994 authored an article, Nature and Grace, an Ecological Perspective. She's also author of A Heroic Vision concerning the work of Ernest Becker and Reality Check. So you can see that we have speakers tonight who have been pretty immersed in Becker thought for many years and are helping us to address this topic of the relationship between denial of death and denial of ecological change and actually violence toward the world we live in. So with those comments, I'd like to ask Dr. Mowrey to do our first kickoff speech.
Before I begin, we're going to have a brief word from our sponsors. The first is a landscaping company. What's interesting about this landscaping company is it's gone through a name change over the years. It began as Kim Lawn, and as that became less and less popular, they added True Green. But just in case you thought they were serious, they misspelled the true so that we knew what was really going on. Our second sponsor, we've got an ad for a movie that I don't think it's too ambitious to say that it will become an iconic image of its era.
Plastics.
So on with the program. It's great to be here, a part of this program this evening. I haven't been here in a few years, but I've watched in a newsletter and the web page and also YouTube some of the programs you've been doing with educators and community leaders on violence, and it's exciting to be with you tonight. The theme for this year is violence against nature, and as probably a lot of you know, a lot of people interested in Becker have been following and discussing an article by Janice Dickinson that was published last year using the ideas of Becker to try to figure out the resistant responses people are having to information about global climate change, among other environmental problems. Sally Cannell and Sheldon Solomon and I have all written on the theme of the environment and ecology using Becker's ideas. And we were invited this year to speak on that same topic, and we were asked also to get into conversation with Janice Dickinson's article, which I busily did over the summer. And as this program started shaping up and I realized how much of Dickinson's work was going to be mentioned and referred to, I contacted Neil and I said, well, you know, I think a lot of people have probably read this, but maybe not everybody, and maybe we need to explain her argument. And I realized, being the first speaker, if Neil thought that was a good idea, I would be rewriting my paper, so that's what I did. I want to tell you what I'm going to do first. I left some outlines around on your tables. Dickinson's article is pretty complicated, and if you can see where we're going, I think it'll help you as we go. So you can refer to that as we go. I'll start off by reviewing her argument. It's a rather complex and long argument. I'm not trying to cover it all, but I would like you to try to understand the logic of the position she's pushing and the sources she's using. The sources, I think, will be familiar to you. A lot of Becker's ideas, research and findings from terror management theory. And after I cover that, I've got some responses of my own, some recommendations. As you look down the outline, you can see my initials are MEM. So I've identified the context of my major recommendations and responses to Dickinson's article. I'm not going to talk about them as I go through. I'll talk about them at the end. But if you're looking on the outline, you'll at least see the context I'm referring to, and that may help. Dickinson's article is titled "The People Paradox: Self-Esteem Striving, Immortality, Ideologies, and the Human Response to Climate Change." As she begins her argument, she presents some findings about the sequence of events that were documented as HIV/AIDS information hit the airwaves and hit our communities. The pattern was repeated over and over. The scientific evidence increases rapidly. People tend to respond with avoidance, denial, recriminations. There's little behavioral change until the situation becomes truly drastic. For Dickinson, the implications of this scenario are very scary for addressing environmental problems. And she asks, why is there such a disconnect between what we know, what we value, and how we behave? She words her paradox from the title this way. Given that most modern forms of heroism hinder our chances of survival, a better understanding of psychological motivations might help us find ways to generate more rational and sustained responses to global climate change in the short term, and reveal ways that individuals and institutions can foster more rational responses to long-term environmental crises. The main sources she draws on quite a few, but I'm mostly going to focus on her ideas from Becker and from terror management theory. The ideas she uses from Becker, I think, are probably familiar to you. She focuses primarily on self-esteem striving, which we can also call heroism, transfer idealization, which is related to immersion and deference to charismatic leaders whom we see as magic helpers, as Fromm would call them. And thirdly, worldview defense and antagonism directed towards outgroups or any groups that threaten one's own worldview. Dickinson notes that human beings are conscious of the inevitability of death, and they suppress thoughts of death to manage that anxiety. But death anxiety is ubiquitous, and suppression alone is inadequate. And so we have developed two other solutions: heroism and immersion. We repress death and take on a comprehensive cultural worldview which provides a context for heroism. Or we rely on transference and submit or immerse ourselves in deference to those associated with great power and value. Death anxiety is the source of our desire for heroism, and it's heroism that gives us a feeling that we have achieved some special status or triumph, that gives our lives a significance that endures beyond our brief biological lives. Heroism, then, is our means to transcend death. It is our immortality strategy, and so we will do whatever is required to demonstrate the superiority of our particular kind of heroism. If it endures, we endure. and so we are easily aroused to antagonism toward anything that might challenge or undermine our heroic ideologies and strategies, even when doing so is harmful to us. There's a real chilling logic here that she will be referring to, and that is when we become so invested in our heroic strategies and ideologies, we would die to see them prevail because our biological lives must end, but symbolically we can live on as long as our heroic vision, our heroic ideology remains dominant. Becker focuses on our defenses of our cultural worldviews and hero systems as a means of death denial, and Dickinson notes that this reflects Western society's increasingly distant relationship to nature and rejection of death as an integral part of life. These are the main ideas she uses from Becker. She uses quite a lot of research for terror management theories, but I think we can follow the logic of the progression of her argument by focusing on just a few. She's especially interested in terror management findings on our defenses, our defensive reactions to global climate change. She's going to assume that global climate change is a death prime, by which she means information about the degradation of nature reminds us of our vulnerability and therefore raises our death anxiety. That hasn't been established yet through empirical research, but it's not much of a stretch. So we're going to operate with her assumptions. First of all, she looks at proximal defenses. These are responses to the most immediate kinds of death primes that rise into our conscious mind. They involve both suppression and cognitive distortions that deflect acknowledgement of the inevitability of death. This defense explains the tendency for people to deny the validity of information and research that indicates that their lives may be in danger. Dickinson considers the effect of proximal defenses on global climate change, and she predicts this kind of response. First of all, people will deny climate change. When that becomes more difficult, they'll deny that human beings are the causes of climate change, or at least they'll minimize or project far into the future the impact of climate change. Even those who accept the research regarding climate change will underestimate the need for more immediate response. As conditions worsen, it's likely that more and more people will revert to these kinds of defenses. Besides proximal defenses, there are distal defenses. These are largely symbolic and unconscious responses to death primes and subliminal death stimuli. They diminish death anxiety primarily by shifting attention to the bolstering of self-esteem and heroism. This means that distal defenses produce counterintuitive responses to death anxiety. People don't choose the strategy that's least likely to result in harm or death. They choose the strategy that most bolsters their hero system, their self-esteem, as a way of dealing with death anxiety. Applying this distressing information, Dickinson predicts that when we look at global climate change, we'll see people respond to information about climate change with increased transference, ideation, and resistance to critique of charismatic leaders. Increased striving for heroic achievement and display, for example, consumerism, defiant consumerism. Increased antagonism towards outgroups that challenge one's own heroic strategies, increased efforts to bolster our heroic worldview, even if it isn't sustainable. The logic here is pretty simple. Defeat, destroy the message, the messenger, and anybody who supports the message in order to prove that one's own heroic worldview and heroic leaders are superior. Heroism is indeed more important than survival. Drawing just on this information, Dickinson sees several problems but also some possibilities for global climate change. First of all, she acknowledges that at this point we lack the basic understanding for how we might use these insights to effectively design educational structures and programs to elicit more rational responses to global climate change.